The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 1st chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was the life. This life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light. He was not the light, but came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not receive him. But all those who received him, who believed on his name, he gave power to become children of God, who are born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The good news of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Our psalm this morning is from the Message. It's Psalm 148. And I noticed something as I was preparing and reading for these lessons. And this service is a participatory service. So, there's two hallelujahs in this. Right in the beginning and right in the end. When we start off, we're going to hit it and say it loud. When we finish, we're going to say it loud. Got it? Good. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Try it again. Hallelujah. Praise God from heaven.
Praise him from the mountaintops. Praise him, all you his angels. Praise him, all you his warriors. Praise him, sun and moon. Praise him, you morning stars. Praise him, high heaven. Praise him, heavenly rain clouds. Praise, let them praise the name of God. He spoke the word, and there they were. He set them in place from all time to eternity. He gave his orders, and that's it. Praise God from earth, you sea dragons, you fathomless ocean deeps. Fire and hail, snow and ice, hurricanes obeying his orders, mountains and all hills, apple orchards and cedar forests, wild beasts and herds of cattle, snakes and birds in flight, earth's kings and all races, leaders and important people, robust men and women in their prime, and yes, graybeards and little children. Let them praise the name of God. It is the only name worth praising. His radiance exceeds anything in earth and sky. He built a monument, his very own people. Praise from all who love God, Israel's children, intimate friends of God. Hallelujah!
Good job. Today's scripture lesson is the first creation story found in Genesis 1. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. And he called the dome sky. And then there was evening, and then there was morning, the second day. And God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was very good. And then God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plant yielding seeds, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds of every single kind, and trees with every kind bearing fruit with seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And then there was evening, and then there was morning, the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night. And let them be signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule day, and the lesser light to rule night and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And then there was evening, and then there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. So God created great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. Then there was evening, and then there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind. And it was so. God made wild animals of every kind, and cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likenesses, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds in the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast on the earth, and to every bird in the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw everything that he made, and indeed, it was very good. Then there was evening, and then there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
It's with joy and thanksgiving that we receive the gift of earth, the gift of water, the gift of seeds and plants, the gift of life. And we remember occasionally, but unfortunately we are people of this generation and of this age, and so we spend our time not in the midst of creation, not in the midst of the earth, not in contact, in touching the earth, but how many hours of FaceTime a day do you get on your phone, your computer, your TV? How many hours of FaceTime? And how many hours of FaceTime do you get on with, whoa, there's no stuff there. That blue line fooled me. I got to stay over here because sure as shooting, I'm going to tangle my feet in that plastic. We've become disconnected from the earth. I hope that yesterday you had the chance to finally be able to be outside, to put your hands in the soil, to touch the ground, to, if nothing else, to be able to walk outside and feel the sunshine, and to be able to just be aware that it is good to be alive, it is good to be created, it is good to be a creature. It is just a marvelous thing. Did you ever think about the richness of soil? And did you ever think about that every piece and part of your body in some way comes from the soil and from the water? Are you aware that you are created in God's image? You've heard two creation stories today. The first one that I told is out of John, but the one that Dick read was the very first creation story. There's two creation stories in Genesis. And the first creation story in Genesis is an adaptation of the Gilgamesh epic, a Babylonian creation story. And it begins with this large monster, and the monster split in two, and one side becomes land, and the other side becomes water. And many other the pieces and parts touch similarly upon the creation story that God's people have recorded. But when God's people tell the story, they tell it different. Most creation stories have a battle involved and a victor winning and usually some kind of sun god winning. But in the creation story that we have received, you have a powerful God, whose very word itself calls life into being. And I hope you notice that at the end of every day, well, there's a pattern to it. God speaks, it happens, then the phrase, and it was so, and then the next to the last line is, and it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, whatever day it was. It was good, evening, morning. 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 And on the sixth day, the day when God made human beings in his image and all the creatures of the land, he says, it was very good. Very good. Very good. we often forget that we are created in goodness, that creation is good, and we have become so caught up in this world that we have made from the things of this world that we assume our made world is the world. How many of you, don't put your hands up because it's very embarrassing, how many of you have complained this spring about the weather and the snow and the cold because it's not 72 to 75 degrees? Okay, I got a couple of amens, white amens. Some people escape to Florida, to Texas, to go places where they can live in warmth, and I bless them with cold weather from time to time. I am so glad they get cold weather from time to time. But now we're used to cars with, the temperature range we live in is just so small. I really learned, and I know I've told this story before, but I really learned of our ability to adapt to a wider variety of temperatures the summer that Andrew worked for the U.S. Department of Forestry. And he had a biology degree, and so he was hired to work in the forests of Michigan. He had a GPS and a notebook, and in every quarter of an acre, he had to go in and list every plant in that quarter of an acre. I said, Andrew, you had to count? He said, well, you could say it was like 10% this kind of grass or 30% this kind of evergreen tree, but as much as possible, if it was large enough, you were to count it. And so he described about how he would get up early in the morning, about 6 o'clock at first light, and he would head out. He talked about the great surprise in walking through the forest, and all of a sudden a deer explodes just 2 feet in front of you, or a grouse flies up, and he said, but he said, when I went, it was 50 degrees. So he said I wore a sweatshirt or 2 sweatshirts, and then by the time it was 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock when he was heading back, he said I had stripped down to just my t-shirt. He said pretty soon I decided, well, I just needed my t-shirt, and that's all he would wear. And so he learned to adapt in a temperature range from 50 to somewhere 70, 75. And I discovered how powerful that adaptation was that September when we had tickets to an Indians game in September. And we didn't come prepared for rain, but it rained. And we didn't get wet, but we got damp. And Andrew is driving back, and he has the window down and his shirt off because it's wet. I'm in my wet shirt, damp shirt, and I am freezing. But he's perfectly comfortable because he's learned to adapt. Unfortunately, we have adapted the other way. We have forgotten that we are people of the earth and the water and the sky. We have forgotten that we are connected with one another, that all of us are made of matter and energy and water and life and light. Genesis reminds us of that. We didn't get as much stuff brought as I was hoping, but then again, we are people who, well, we don't need farmers because we buy our food from the grocery store. So it's really not high on our worries this year. We have lots of worries and fears, but fear of starvation, I suspect, is way, way, way down there for most of us. But not so for people in many parts of the world. Not so for our ancestors. Is it any wonder that our ancestors that worship began with the sacrifice of animals and plants? on an altar, trying to somehow connect with God and pray God's blessing upon the land, that there be water. We take this for granted. We live in one of the most abundant places of water in the face of the earth. We live in one of the most fertile areas in the face of the earth in terms of productivity and land that can grow crops. And we take it for granted. But most of all, I think we forget that it is God who made it, that it is God who made us. And I think that this is one of the things that we think of God as being spirit, as being some energy or force out there, and we forget that God is in and a part of everything. It's a very famous story. You've all read it at one time or another. The story of the prince and the pauper. The story of how the king's son exchanges places with one of the common people. And all of the funny stories that happen when a commoner tries to live in the rich court life and has no clue of how to do anything. And about how the king's son suddenly realizes the challenges and the difficulties of everyday people. And therefore, when they switch places again, the king's son, when he becomes king, he rules with benevolence and wisdom and solves the problems that he is totally unaware of before this experience. And often we think that that's the way God was, that God sent his son so that God could know exactly what it was like to be a human being. And it describes the Son of God with that phrase, in the beginning was the Word. Now that same Word that spoke creation, but in the beginning was the Word, this ethereal, this verbal, this intellectual, this spiritual. And it says not only did creation come into being through this, but it said the Word became flesh. And here's the total opposite of the story that we always tell with the prince and the pauper. The Word became flesh, full of grace and truth, so that we could see with our own eyes and hear with our own ears and touch with our own hands like Thomas and all the rest of the disciples, so that we could see, hear, touch, taste, experience God. That God gave up all that was godly so that he could be God in our midst. And that is the great wonder of creation. That God so blesses us with a way to see how we might live and how we might be. And to know that God has experienced everything that we've experienced. The joy of birth, the laughter of friends, the taste of a good meal, the warmth, the sunshine, the abandonment, the loneliness in the desert, the desperate hanging on to life, and indeed the pain and suffering that comes to all of us. Because the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory as the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. So now we know how to live. Now we know how to live, to care for the earth, to care for the plants and the animals of the earth, to treasure the water of the earth. And we remember, oh yes, we forget, but we remember with joy and thanksgiving that everything, life itself is gift.